During a crucial meeting with an Arab billionaire, the CEO and his team were about to lose a major deal due to the language barrier. Just then, a humble black cleaning lady surprised everyone by speaking multiple languages fluently, including Arabic. Thanks to her, the deal was sealed. Grateful, the CEO did something that changed her life forever. Just before we begin, your presence means a lot. Say hi and share where you're tuning in from, only if you want to. His Italian suit immaculate and his confidence absolute. Today was the day that would change everything, or so he believed. Mr. Morrison, the delegation from Al Rashid Holdings has arrived, announced Jennifer Walsh, his executive assistant, her voice tight with nervous energy. At 28, she'd worked for Morrison for 3 years, but she'd never seen him this focused on a single deal. Robert straightened his burgundy tie and checked his Rolex. 2:30 p.m., November 15th, 2023. Excellent. How's the presentation set up? Perfect, sir. Marketing has the projections ready, legal has the contracts prepared, and Jennifer hesitated. Sir, there might be one small issue. Robert's jaw tightened. What kind of issue, Jennifer? Well, the primary negotiator, Mr. Khalil al-Rashid, apparently prefers to conduct business in Arabic. Our translator cancelled this morning due to a family emergency. For a moment, Robert felt his world tilt. This deal with Al Rashid Holdings wasn't just another contract. It was a $500 million partnership that would expand Morrison Industries into the Middle Eastern market, potentially doubling their annual revenue. 3 months of negotiations, countless late nights, and his company's entire future growth strategy hinged on the next 2 hours. Get me another translator, now. I've called every translation service in the city, sir. It's short notice, and then we proceed in English. Khalil speaks English, doesn't he? Jennifer's expression said everything. He does, but his nephew mentioned he's much more comfortable in Arabic for business negotiations. Apparently, it's a matter of respect and cultural preference. Robert ran his hand through his silver hair, a habit from his younger days that emerged only during moments of extreme stress. At 55, he'd built Morrison Industries from his father's small construction company into a diversified empire worth $2.3 billion. He hadn't gotten here by accepting defeat. The conference room buzzed with quiet tension. Around the mahogany table sat Robert's key executives, David Chen, CFO, 42 years old and brilliant with numbers, Sarah Williams, head of marketing, 36 and sharp as a razor, and Michael Torres, legal counsel, 49 and known for closing impossible deals. Across from them sat Khalil al-Rashid, a distinguished man in his early 60s with intelligent dark eyes and an air of quiet authority. His net worth of $8.2 billion made him one of the most influential businessmen in the Gulf region. Beside him sat his nephew and translator, Ahmad, a young man of 25 who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Morrison, Ahmad began carefully, my uncle appreciates your hospitality, but he would feel more confident proceeding in Arabic. Perhaps we should reschedule? Robert felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the conference room's perfect climate control. Rescheduling meant losing momentum, and in business, momentum was everything. Competitors were circling like vultures, and Al Rashid Holdings had 3 other companies vying for this partnership. Please tell your uncle that we absolutely respect his preferences, Robert said, maintaining his professional smile while internally calculating how much this delay would cost. However, today's timing is crucial for market conditions, and the conference room door opened quietly, and in walked Grace Washington. Grace Washington had been invisible to most people at Morrison Industries for the past 8 years. At 43, she moved through the gleaming halls with quiet efficiency, her cleaning cart a constant companion, her presence barely noticed by the executives who rushed past her with phones pressed to their ears and million-dollar deals on their minds. But Grace noticed everything. She noticed that Mr. Chen always stayed late on Wednesdays to call his elderly mother in Taiwan, speaking in rapid Mandarin that reminded her of her college linguistics classes. She noticed that Ms. Williams practiced her presentations in French when she thought no one was listening, preparing for the European expansion that everyone whispered about. She noticed that Mr. Torres hummed old songs in Spanish when he was deep in thought, the same songs her neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez sang while hanging laundry. What none of them knew was that Grace Washington held a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown University, spoke 7 languages fluently, and had once worked as a cultural liaison for the State Department. But that was before Marcus got sick, before the medical bills mounted like storm clouds, before her world narrowed to the space between survival and hope. Now, as she entered the conference room with her supplies, she immediately recognized the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Her trained ear caught the musical cadence of Arabic being spoken in hushed, frustrated tones by the older gentleman at the table's head. "I apologize," she said softly, addressing the room in general. "I can return later to clean if you prefer." The young man serving as translator looked up gratefully. "No, please, it's fine. We were just—" He glanced nervously at his uncle, who was speaking in rapid Arabic. Grace's eyes widened slightly as she understood every word. Khalil al-Rashid was expressing his disappointment about the language barrier, his concerns about conducting such an important negotiation without proper cultural and linguistic understanding, and his growing feeling that Morrison Industries might not be the right partner if they couldn't manage this basic requirement. For 8 years, Grace had remained silent, invisible, just another piece of the corporate machinery. But as she listened to this distinguished businessman express his frustration in the language she'd learned during her 2 years stationed in Jordan, something stirred within her. Robert Morrison was studying financial projections with barely concealed desperation when Grace quietly began arranging cleaning supplies on her cart. Then, in fluent Arabic, she addressed Khalil directly. "Mr. Al-Rashid, please accept my apologies for the oversight regarding translation services. Would it be helpful if I assisted with interpretation to ensure clear communication for your important discussion?" The room fell into stunned silence. Khalil's eyebrows rose in surprise, and a slow smile spread across his dignified features. He responded in Arabic, his tone warming considerably. "My goodness, your Arabic is excellent. Yes, that would be most helpful. Are you with Mr. Morrison's international relations team?" Grace felt every eye in the room focused on her. Robert Morrison's expression shifted from shock to something approaching hope. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders like a familiar coat. "I work here at Morrison Industries," she replied in Arabic, then turned to Robert. "Mr. Morrison, if it would be helpful, I could provide interpretation services for your meeting. Mr. Al-Rashid has expressed some concerns about proceeding without proper translation, but he's willing to continue if communication can be clear and respectful." Robert stared at her, really looked at her for perhaps the first time in 8 years. The transformation in the conference room was immediate and electric. Robert Morrison, who prided himself on reading people and situations, felt as though he'd been looking at a puzzle with missing pieces for years, and suddenly the complete picture was revealing itself. "Grace," he said carefully, his voice carrying a new note of respect. "Your language skills, how many do you speak?" Grace felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced years ago when presenting to State Department officials about cultural sensitivities in international negotiations. 7 languages fluently, sir, a few others conversationally." Khalil al-Rashid leaned forward with genuine interest, addressing Grace in Arabic. "This is remarkable. Your pronunciation suggests formal training. Where did you study?" "Georgetown University, sir, and I spent time in Amman and Damascus before." Grace paused, then continued in Arabic. "Before personal circumstances required me to return to domestic responsibilities." The elderly businessman nodded, with understanding that transcended language barriers. He turned to his nephew Ahmad and spoke in rapid Arabic. Grace listened, then addressed Robert. "Mr. Morrison, Mr. Al-Rashid would like to proceed with the meeting. He says that finding someone who speaks his language with such cultural understanding is a good omen for the partnership. He's ready to begin serious negotiations." Robert felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with profound gratitude. "Grace, would you be willing to help us? This meeting is crucial for the company's future." "Of course, sir." Grace moved her cleaning cart to the side and took a position where she could facilitate communication between both parties. What followed was unlike any business meeting in Morrison Industries' history. Grace didn't simply translate words. She bridged cultures, explained nuances, and provided context that transformed the entire dynamic. When Khalil mentioned concepts important in Arab business culture, Grace helped Robert understand not just what was being said, but why it mattered. Mr. Al-Rashid is emphasizing the importance of long-term relationships over immediate profits, Grace explained during a particularly complex exchange. In his culture, business partnerships are viewed as extended family relationships. He wants to know about Morrison Industries' values regarding employee welfare and community impact. Robert found himself sharing aspects of his business philosophy he'd never articulated before, guided by Grace's cultural insights. She helped him understand that Khalil's questions about employee treatment weren't just casual inquiries. They were fundamental assessments of character. "Tell Mr. Al-Rashid about our employee scholarship program," Robert said, watching Grace's face light up with understanding, "and the healthcare benefits we provide." As Grace translated, she added context that elevated Robert's responses. She explained the American cultural significance of these benefits, how they reflected values of opportunity and care that resonated with Khalil's own principles. David Chen, the CFO, leaned over to Sarah Williams and whispered, "She's not just translating, she's conducting diplomacy." The meeting progressed from tentative exploration to serious negotiation. Grace facilitated discussions about profit sharing, cultural exchange programs for employees, and sustainable development practices that would benefit communities in both regions. Her understanding of both business cultures allowed her to suggest creative solutions to potential obstacles. When Khalil raised concerns about ensuring that Middle Eastern cultural values would be respected in the partnership, Grace helped Robert craft responses that demonstrated genuine understanding and commitment. "Mr. Morrison wants to establish a cultural advisory board," Grace translated, "with representatives from both regions to guide decision-making on sensitive issues. He views this partnership as an opportunity to learn and grow, not just to expand market share." Khalil's approval was evident in his relaxed posture and frequent smiles. After 2 hours of intensive negotiation, he stood and extended his hand to Robert. "Mr. Morrison," he said in careful English, "I am very impressed. Your assistant has shown me that Morrison Industries values respect and understanding. We have a deal." As hands were shaken and preliminary agreements outlined, Robert realized that something extraordinary had just occurred, and it had nothing to do with the $500 million contract. The days following the Al-Rashid meeting passed in a blur of legal documentation, contract revisions, and corporate celebration. Morrison Industries' stock price jumped 12% on news of the Middle Eastern partnership, and business journals were already calling it the deal of the decade. But Robert Morrison found himself thinking less about profit margins and more about the woman who had made it all possible. 3 days after the meeting, Robert called Grace to his office. She arrived promptly at 3 p.m., still wearing her custodial uniform, her expression carefully neutral. The massive corner office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, seemed to dwarf her small frame. "Please sit down," Robert said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. Grace perched on the edge of the chair, her hands folded in her lap. "Is there something wrong, Mr. Morrison? If this is about me stepping out of my role during the meeting—" "Grace." Robert's voice was gentle but firm. "You saved this company. Do you understand that?" She looked down at her hands. "I just helped with translation, sir." "No." Robert moved from behind his desk and sat in the chair beside her. "You did something far more important. You showed me that I've been blind to the incredible talent walking these halls every day." He paused, studying her profile. "Grace, I need to know your story. How does someone with your qualifications end up?" He gestured vaguely. Grace was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the Chicago skyline. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. 12 years ago, I was a cultural liaison for the State Department. I loved my work, helping diplomats navigate complex international relationships, preventing misunderstandings that could have serious consequences. A small smile crossed her face. I was good at it too. Languages came naturally to me, and I understood how much culture shapes communication. "What happened?" Grace's expression clouded. "My husband, Marcus, was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at 41. Our insurance covered the basics, but the specialized care he needed, the experimental treatments, we lost our savings in the first year. I had to choose between my career and my family." Robert felt something heavy settle in his chest. "How long have you been taking care of him?" 12 years. He's in a memory care facility now. The best one I could find. The monthly costs are—" She shrugged. "Let's just say they're substantial. I work here during the day, and I clean offices downtown in the evenings. It covers his care and our basic expenses." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of sacrificed dreams and quiet heroism. "Grace," Robert said finally, "I want to offer you a position. Director of International Relations, full benefits, competitive salary, and immediate oversight of the Al-Rashid Partnership integration." Grace's eyes widened. "Mr. Morrison, that's incredibly generous, but I can't. My schedule with Marcus's care and the evening work I need to maintain—" "The salary would be $180,000 annually, plus performance bonuses," Robert interrupted. "Your husband's care would be covered under our executive health plan, which includes specialized medical needs. And Grace." He leaned forward. "You wouldn't be working for me. You'd be working with me. This company needs your expertise more than I realized." Grace stared at him in stunned silence, her eyes filling with tears she'd held back for years. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" Robert thought about his answer carefully. At 55, he'd built his success on recognizing opportunity and talent. But this was something different, something that went beyond business instincts. "Because 3 days ago, you showed me what leadership really looks like. You saw a problem, you had the solution, and you stepped forward despite having no obligation to help. You didn't do it for recognition or reward. You did it because it was right." He smiled. "Besides, Khalil specifically requested that you oversee the cultural aspects of our partnership. Apparently he was more impressed with you than with me." Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so unguarded it made Robert realize how carefully she usually controlled her emotions. I need to think about this. It's been so long since I've worked in this field. What if I've lost my edge? What if I disappoint you?" "Grace." Robert said quietly. "You just negotiated a $500 million deal in a language I don't even speak, with cultural nuances I never would have understood. Trust me, you haven't lost anything." As Grace left his office that evening, Robert stood at his window watching the cleaning crews arrive for the night shift. How many other remarkable people was he overlooking every single day? That evening, Grace Washington sat in the memory care facility's quiet lounge, holding Marcus's hand while he stared out the window at nothing in particular. At 51, her husband still possessed the gentle features that had first caught her attention at a State Department reception 22 years earlier, but his eyes held the distant, unfocused quality that had become heartbreakingly familiar. "I got an incredible offer today, baby," she whispered, her thumb tracing circles on his palm. "A real job. The kind I used to dream about." Marcus turned toward her voice, and for a moment Grace saw a flicker of recognition in his brown eyes. These moments had become precious and rare, like finding diamonds in ordinary sand. "Grace?" His voice was soft, uncertain. "Yes, I'm here." Her heart soared at the sound of her name on his lips. "You look worried. Something wrong at work?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. Marcus's memories lived in fragments now, scattered across decades. Sometimes he remembered their wedding day with perfect clarity, but couldn't recall what he'd eaten an hour ago. Today, somehow, he'd captured her current emotion with the same intuition that had made him such a gifted therapist before his diagnosis. Not wrong, exactly. Different. Someone wants to give me a chance to use my education again, to do meaningful work. Marcus squeezed her hand with surprising strength. That's wonderful. You're so smart, Grace. So talented. I always worried I was holding you back from your potential." The clarity in his voice was stunning and devastating. Grace realized she was experiencing one of Marcus's increasingly rare, lucid moments, and she wanted to capture every second. "You never held me back," she whispered fiercely. "Loving you and caring for you. It's the most important work I've ever done." Marcus's eyes studied her face with the focused intensity she remembered from their early years together. "But you need more, don't you? You need to use that brilliant mind of yours. I can't remember much anymore. But I remember how your eyes lit up when you talked about your work with diplomats and international relations." Grace felt her careful composure crumbling. "Marcus, I can't leave you. The evening job helps pay for this place, and if I take this new position, everything would change." "Change how?" "Better insurance, better coverage for your care, but also more responsibility, longer hours during the day. I might not be able to visit as often." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, his gaze drifting back to the window. Grace feared the moment of clarity was passing, that he was slipping back into the fog that increasingly claimed his thoughts. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the wisdom that had made him such an effective counselor. "Grace, do you know what I regret most about this disease?" She shook her head, unable to speak. "Not the memories I've lost, not even the future we won't have together the way we planned." He turned back to her, his eyes completely present. "I regret that my illness has made you smaller than you're meant to be. You were born to bridge worlds, to help people understand each other. That's your gift." Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "If there's a chance for you to do that work again, you have to take it. For both of us." Marcus lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently. "I may not remember this conversation tomorrow, but right now, I'm telling you, fly, Grace. Spread those wings you've kept folded for so long." Later that night, Grace sat in her small apartment, surrounded by boxes of her old State Department materials, language textbooks, cultural guides, diplomatic protocols she'd helped develop. She'd kept everything, unable to throw away the artifacts of her former life. She pulled out a photo from a reception in Beirut, showing her standing between two diplomats who'd been locked in a bitter dispute until she'd helped them find common ground. The woman in the photo looked confident, purposeful, alive with professional passion. Grace looked at her reflection in the window and saw a tired cleaning lady in a uniform that smelled faintly of industrial disinfectant. But beneath the surface, something was stirring, a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in 12 years. She reached for her phone and dialed Robert Morrison's direct number. Robert Morrison was reviewing quarterly projections in his home study when his phone rang at 9:47 p.m. The caller ID showed Grace Washington's number, and he answered immediately. "Grace, is everything all right? Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry to call so late. I know this is presumptuous, but could we meet tomorrow morning, before regular business hours? I have some questions about the position you offered." Robert heard something different in her voice, a note of possibility that hadn't been there during their afternoon conversation. "Of course. My office, 7 a.m. Actually, sir, could we meet in the company cafeteria? I have a proposal that goes beyond just accepting the job." The next morning, Robert arrived at the empty cafeteria to find Grace already seated at a corner table, several manila folders spread before her. She traded her custodial uniform for a simple but professional navy dress that transformed her entire presence. Her hair was styled neatly, and she wore minimal but elegant makeup that highlighted her intelligent dark eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison. Thank you for meeting me here." Robert poured himself coffee from the self-service station and joined her. "You look different today." Grace smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile he'd ever seen from her. "I feel different. Yesterday, after our conversation, I went home and really thought about everything. Then I spent the evening with my husband, and he reminded me of something important." "What's that?" "That I've been thinking too small." Grace opened the first folder, revealing detailed organizational charts and cultural competency frameworks. "Mr. Morrison, Morrison Industries is about to enter multiple international markets. The Al Rashid partnership is just the beginning, isn't it?" Robert nodded, intrigued by her directness. "You're going to need more than just translation services. You're going to need cultural integration, sensitivity training for your executives, and systematic approaches to international relationship building." Grace pulled out a second folder containing research she'd compiled about Morrison Industries' expansion plans. "I spent 4 hours last night researching your company's growth strategy, and I see opportunities you probably haven't even considered yet." "Such as?" Grace's eyes lit up with professional enthusiasm. "Did you know that 3 of your current cleaning staff are former professionals from their home countries? Maria Santos was an economics professor in Guatemala. Chen Wei was an engineer in Beijing. Ahmed Hassan was a physician in Syria before the war." Robert stared at her in amazement. "I had no idea. That's exactly my point. You have incredible human resources right under your nose, but there's no system in place to identify or utilize that talent. What if we created a program to discover and develop these hidden assets?" Grace opened a third folder, revealing a detailed proposal she'd drafted in the early hours of the morning. "I'm proposing we establish not just an international relations department, but a cultural integration initiative. We'd identify multilingual and multicultural talent throughout the organization, provide professional development opportunities, and create pathways for advancement based on cultural competency and language skills." Robert studied the documents, his business instincts recognizing the brilliance of her vision. "This is comprehensive. How did you develop this overnight?" "I didn't develop it overnight," Grace said quietly. "I've been thinking about these issues for 12 years. Watching talented people settle for less than their potential because systems don't exist to recognize their value. I've been one of those people." She leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. Mr. Morrison, you offered me a chance to change my life, and I'm grateful beyond words, but I want to propose something bigger. Let me change how this company approaches human development. Let me help you discover the Grace Washingtons in every department. Robert felt that familiar tingle of recognition that came when he encountered truly exceptional opportunity. What would you need? A team of 3 to start. Budget for professional assessments and development programs, and most importantly, executive support for cultural change throughout the organization. Grace paused. And I'd like to start by offering Marcus's former colleagues, retired diplomats and cultural specialists, consulting opportunities. Many of them would welcome part-time work that utilizes their expertise. The proposal was ambitious, innovative, and potentially transformative. Robert found himself thinking not just about immediate business benefits, but about the dozens of employees whose potential might be unlocked by Grace's vision. "Grace," he said finally, "I offered you a job yesterday. Today you're proposing to revolutionize how we think about human capital." Grace Washington, who had spent 8 years invisible in the corridors of Morrison Industries, met his gaze with quiet confidence. "Yes, sir, I am." The morning sun streamed through the cafeteria windows, illuminating the documents spread between them, blueprints for transformation that neither of them had imagined just 24 hours earlier. 6 months after Grace Washington's transformation from cleaning lady to director of cultural integration, Morrison Industries had become unrecognizable. The sterile corporate environment had evolved into a vibrant multicultural hub where conversations flowed in multiple languages and cultural celebrations filled the calendar. Grace stood in her new office on the 38th floor, reviewing quarterly reports that exceeded every projection. The Cultural Integration Initiative had identified 47 employees with advanced degrees or professional experience from their home countries. Maria Santos now served as economic advisor for Latin American markets. Chen Wei had been promoted to international engineering consultant. Ahmed Hassan was developing medical device partnerships in the Middle East, but success had brought unexpected challenges. "Grace, we need to talk." Jennifer Walsh, Robert's executive assistant, appeared in the doorway looking troubled. At 29, Jennifer had initially resented Grace's rapid promotion, viewing it as favoritism rather than merit-based advancement. "What's the concern, Jennifer?" Jennifer closed the office door and sat down heavily. "There's pushback from some of the senior executives. They're calling your initiative diversity theater and questioning whether we're promoting people based on cultural background rather than qualifications." Grace felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. She'd anticipated this resistance, but facing it still stung. Who specifically? Richard Hayes from Operations has been the most vocal. He told the board yesterday that we're lowering standards to accommodate political correctness. Jennifer's voice dropped. And Grace, he's got allies. Some of the department heads are concerned about the costs of the language training programs and cultural competency workshops. Grace turned to look out her window at the Chicago skyline, the same view she'd once admired from the conference room where her life had changed. 6 months ago, she'd been invisible. Now, she was too visible, her every decision scrutinized and questioned. "There's something else," Jennifer continued reluctantly. "Richard has been investigating your background. He found out about your previous position with the State Department and the gap in your employment history. He's asking questions about why someone with your qualifications was working as custodial staff." The implication was clear. If Grace had been hiding her qualifications for 8 years, what else might she be hiding? That afternoon, Grace attended her first hostile board meeting. Richard Hayes, a 62-year-old operations director with 30 years at Morrison Industries, had prepared a presentation challenging the Cultural Integration Initiative's effectiveness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "while we all appreciate diversity, we must question whether we're making hiring and promotion decisions based on merit or on fashionable social initiatives." He clicked through slides showing increased training costs, extended onboarding times, and what he characterized as disruption to established workflows. "Furthermore," Richard continued, his eyes finding Grace in the boardroom, "I believe we should examine whether the architect of these changes has been completely transparent about her own background and motivations." Grace felt the temperature in the room shift. Board members who had celebrated her success just months earlier now studied her with new scrutiny. Robert Morrison, seated at the head of the polished conference table, maintained his composure, but Grace could see tension in his jaw. "Richard, what exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Robert. I'm stating facts. Ms. Washington worked in janitorial services for 8 years while possessing advanced degrees and professional experience. That raises questions about her judgment, her honesty, and her suitability for executive leadership." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Grace realized that her greatest vulnerability wasn't her qualifications. It was the very circumstances that had led to her discovery. In Richard's narrative, her years of sacrifice became evidence of deception rather than dedication. Grace stood slowly, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Mr. Hayes raises important points that deserve honest answers." She moved to the front of the room, facing the board members who would decide her fate and the future of the initiative she'd built. "You're right to question my choices. For 8 years, I worked as custodial staff while holding a master's degree in international relations. That wasn't deception, it was survival." Grace's voice grew stronger. "My husband was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at 41. The medical costs and care requirements meant I needed flexible employment that could accommodate his needs." She paused, studying the faces around the table. "I could have disclosed my background when I was hired, but I needed the job, not recognition. I wasn't looking for a career. I was looking for stability during the most difficult period of my life." Richard Hayes leaned forward. "And now, we're expected to believe that someone who hid her qualifications for nearly a decade is the right person to lead cultural integration and employee development." The challenge hung in the air like a sword. Grace felt the weight of not just her own future, but the futures of Maria, Chen, Ahmed, and dozens of other employees whose potential depended on programs she'd created. "Mr. Hayes," Grace said quietly, "I understand your concerns. But I'd like you to consider this. Who better to identify and develop hidden talent than someone who understands what it means to have your abilities overlooked? Who better to create systems for recognizing potential than someone who spent 8 years being invisible?" The boardroom confrontation had shaken Grace more than she cared to admit. That evening, she sat in Marcus's memory care facility, mechanically helping him with dinner while replaying Richard Hayes's accusations. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Her greatest strength as an advocate for overlooked talent stemmed from years of being overlooked herself, yet that very experience was now being weaponized against her. "You're quiet tonight," Marcus observed, surprising her with his clarity. His lucid moments had become increasingly rare, making each one precious and unpredictable. "Just work stuff, baby. Nothing for you to worry about." Marcus set down his fork and studied her face with the focused attention she remembered from their early years together. "Grace, I may not remember what I had for breakfast, but I know when you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Talk to me." Grace felt tears welling up. Someone at work is trying to discredit me. They're saying I can't be trusted because I hid my background for so long. They're questioning everything I've built. Are they right? The question startled her. What do you mean? Marcus reached for her hand with the deliberate movement that characterized his current limitations. Did you hide your background because you were ashamed of your abilities, or because you were protecting what mattered most? I was protecting you, protecting us. Then you did nothing wrong. Marcus's voice carried a firmness that cut through his usual confusion. Grace, I was a therapist for 20 years before this disease took that away from me. I spent my career helping people understand that sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest strengths. Your years of struggle didn't diminish your qualifications, they enhanced them. Grace squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his unexpected wisdom. But what if they're right about one thing? What if I'm not ready for this level of responsibility? What if I fail all the people counting on me? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window where evening shadows were gathering. When he spoke again, his voice was soft but certain. Do you remember our wedding day? You were terrified about walking down the aisle in front of all those people. You said you felt like an imposter in that white dress. Grace nodded. Surprised, he remembered such a specific detail. But you weren't an imposter then, and you're not an imposter now. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. Marcus smiled with heartbreaking tenderness. The only difference between then and now is that more people are watching. Don't let their attention make you forget who you are. The next morning, Grace arrived at Morrison Industries with renewed determination. She spent the early hours before the executive team arrived reviewing every decision she'd made, every promotion she'd recommended, every program she'd implemented. The data was overwhelming. Productivity was up across all departments, employee satisfaction had reached record highs, and international partnerships were exceeding revenue projections. But data wouldn't be enough to overcome the politics of perception. At 9 a.m., Grace knocked on Robert Morrison's office door. She found him standing at his window, his usual morning coffee untouched on his desk. "Robert, I need to address something directly." He turned, and she saw exhaustion in his eyes. "Grace, about yesterday's board meeting. I want to offer my resignation." Robert's expression shifted to alarm. "What?" "Grace, no, we're not giving in to Richard's pressure tactics." "I'm not offering to resign because I think I've done anything wrong," Grace said firmly. "I'm offering because I want you to have the option of accepting it if that's what's best for the company and the programs we've built." She moved to the conference table where they'd first discussed her vision 6 months earlier. "But before you decide, I want to show you something." Grace opened her laptop and displayed a presentation she'd prepared in the pre-dawn hours. "These are the numbers Richard Hayes didn't share with the board yesterday." The first slide showed employee retention rates, up 37% since the Cultural Integration Initiative launched. The second displayed customer satisfaction scores from international clients, the highest in company history. The third revealed something even more compelling. Internal promotion rates had doubled, with 73% of promotions going to employees who'd been with the company for more than 5 years, but had never advanced before. "Richard talks about lowering standards," Grace continued, "but what he's really objecting to is changing standards. We're not promoting people despite their backgrounds. We're promoting them because of the unique value those backgrounds bring." Robert studied the data, his business instincts engaging despite the political pressure. "These numbers are remarkable, Grace, but you know this isn't just about performance metrics." "You're right. It's about something bigger." Grace opened a folder containing letters and emails she'd been collecting for months. "These are from employees throughout the company, people who never imagined they'd have opportunities for advancement. People who are contributing at levels nobody expected because someone finally recognized their potential. She pulled out a handwritten note from Maria Santos. Ms. Washington, because of your program, I'm using my economics background to help Morrison Industries understand Latin American markets. For the first time in 15 years, I feel like my education and experience matter. Thank you for seeing me. Another letter from Chen Wei. I thought my engineering knowledge would never be useful again in America. Now I'm developing solutions for infrastructure projects in Asia. You didn't just give me a job, you gave me back my professional identity. Robert read through several letters, his expression thoughtful. Grace, this is incredible feedback, but Richard Hayes and his allies don't care about individual success stories. They care about maintaining systems that have worked for them. Grace closed the laptop and looked directly at Robert. So here's what I propose. Give me 90 days to prove definitively that the Cultural Integration Initiative isn't just good for morale, it's good for business. If I can't demonstrate measurable ROI that satisfies even the skeptics, I'll resign and recommend a transition plan that protects the employees we've promoted. Robert was quiet for several minutes, weighing options and consequences. Finally, he looked up with the decisive expression Grace had learned to recognize. 90 days, Grace, but I want full transparency with the board throughout the process. Richard gets to review everything, and if he finds legitimate concerns, we address them immediately. As Grace left Robert's office, she felt the familiar mixture of fear and exhilaration that came with high-stakes challenges. She had 90 days to prove that seeing potential in people wasn't just idealism, it was smart business. The real test was just beginning. 60 days into Grace's 90-day challenge, Morrison Industries was buzzing with an energy that seemed to affect every level of the organization. Grace had transformed the initiative from a feel-good diversity program into a rigorous business development strategy, and the results were starting to speak for themselves. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ahmed Hassan, the former Syrian physician now working in medical device partnerships, had identified a critical gap in Middle Eastern healthcare markets that none of Morrison Industries' traditional analysts had recognized. Grace, you need to see this, Ahmed said, bursting into her office with excitement that reminded her why she'd been drawn to international work in the first place. I've been analyzing the Al-Rashid partnership data, and I found something significant. Ahmed spread out market research and medical infrastructure reports across her desk. Morrison Industries has been approaching Middle Eastern healthcare markets the same way they approach American markets, but the needs are completely different. Equipment that works in Chicago hospitals won't necessarily work in rural clinics in Jordan or Iraq. Grace studied the data, her State Department experience helping her understand the implications immediately. You're talking about cultural and infrastructural adaptation, not just translation. Exactly. And here's the remarkable part. 3 other employees in your cultural integration program have expertise that directly addresses these gaps. Fatima Al-Zahra worked in medical administration in Lebanon. David Kim has experience with low-resource medical technology from his work in rural South Korea. And Maria Santos understands healthcare economics in developing markets. Ahmed's enthusiasm was infectious, but Grace recognized something more significant than just a business opportunity. Ahmed, what you're describing isn't just about adapting existing products. You're talking about developing entirely new solutions. Yes, and Grace, we could do it, not as consultants or advisors, but as the core development team. We have the cultural knowledge, the technical expertise, and the market understanding that no traditional consulting firm could provide. Grace felt that familiar tingle of possibility, the same sensation she'd experienced during her State Department days when disparate elements suddenly aligned into transformative opportunities. But this was bigger than anything she'd tackled before. That afternoon, Grace convened an emergency meeting with the informal advisory group that had evolved around the Cultural Integration Initiative. The conference room filled with faces that represented a United Nations of professional experience. Ahmed Hassan from Syria, Maria Santos from Guatemala, Chen Wei from China, Fatima Al-Zahra from Lebanon, David Kim from South Korea, and 6 others whose backgrounds spanned continents and industries. I've called this meeting because Ahmed has identified what might be the most significant business opportunity in Morrison Industries' history, Grace began. But it's also the most complex challenge we've ever faced. She outlined Ahmed's proposal while watching the faces around the table light up with recognition and excitement. These weren't just employees anymore, they were specialists whose combined expertise represented decades of international experience and cultural insight. What Ahmed is describing would require us to function as more than an integration program, Grace continued. We'd need to become a full-scale international development division, capable of creating products and services specifically designed for global markets that American companies typically ignore or misunderstand. Chen Wei leaned forward. Grace, I've been working on infrastructure projects where this exact approach could revolutionize how American engineering firms operate in Asia. The technical challenges aren't insurmountable, they're cultural. Fatima added, medical administration in the Middle East requires understanding of regulatory frameworks, cultural sensitivities, and economic realities that you can't learn from textbooks, but we lived it. Grace felt the room crackling with the same energy she'd experienced during her most successful State Department negotiations. But she also felt the weight of risk. What they were discussing would require Morrison Industries to invest millions in a completely unproven approach, led by employees who'd been cleaning offices and working support roles just months earlier. Before we get ahead of ourselves, Grace said carefully, we need to understand what we're really proposing. This isn't just about creating new products, it's about fundamentally changing how Morrison Industries approaches international business. We'd be asking Robert to bet the company's future on our ability to succeed in markets where traditional approaches have failed. Maria Santos, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up with a smile that reminded Grace why she'd been drawn to this work. Grace, isn't that exactly what you did 6 months ago? You asked Robert to bet on potential that nobody else could see. The observation hit Grace with surprising force. She realized that the Cultural Integration Initiative had been preparation for exactly this moment. Not just identifying talent, but preparing that talent to tackle challenges that traditional corporate structures couldn't handle. You're right, Grace said slowly. But this time, we're not asking him to bet on one person's potential. We're asking him to bet on an entirely new way of doing business. Ahmed stood up, his expression serious but determined. Then let's make sure we present a proposal that's impossible to refuse. Over the next week, Grace's team worked with the intensity of a startup, developing comprehensive market analyses, financial projections, and implementation strategies. They identified 17 distinct international opportunities where cultural expertise could create competitive advantages worth hundreds of millions in potential revenue. But as the proposal took shape, Grace realized they faced a fundamental challenge. Success would require Morrison Industries to embrace a level of risk and cultural change that went far beyond anything Richard Hayes and his allies would find acceptable. The 90-day deadline was approaching, and Grace knew that her next presentation to the board wouldn't just determine her own future. It would decide whether Morrison Industries would evolve into something unprecedented or retreat to the safety of traditional approaches. Everything she'd worked for, everything Marcus had encouraged her to pursue, and everything her team had discovered about their own potential would be decided in a single meeting, The stakes had never been higher. The boardroom felt different on the morning of Grace's final presentation. The usual corporate politeness had been replaced by an undercurrent of tension that made every gesture feel significant. Richard Hayes sat with a stack of documents that Grace suspected contained challenges to every aspect of her proposal. Robert Morrison occupied his usual position at the head of the table, but his expression was unreadable. Grace had spent the previous night with Marcus, finding him in one of his clearest periods in weeks. He'd listened to her fears about the presentation with the focused attention she remembered from their early years together. "Do you believe in what you've built?" he'd asked. "With everything I have. Then trust that belief. Trust the work. Trust yourself." Now standing before the board with her team seated behind her, Grace drew strength from that conversation and from the months of extraordinary results they'd achieved together. "Ladies and gentlemen, 90 days ago, you challenged me to prove that the Cultural Integration Initiative delivers measurable business value. Today, I'm here to show you that we've exceeded every metric you established and discovered opportunities that will transform Morrison Industries' competitive position globally." Grace clicked through slides showing remarkable performance data. International contracts up 340%, customer satisfaction scores at company record highs, and employee retention rates that surpassed industry benchmarks by substantial margins. But Richard Hayes was ready. "Ms. Washington, these numbers are impressive, but they don't address fundamental concerns about structural changes to our organization. You're asking us to make hiring and promotion decisions based on cultural background rather than traditional qualifications." Grace had anticipated this challenge. "Mr. Hayes, you're absolutely right that we're changing how we evaluate qualifications. But we're not lowering standards. We're expanding our definition of excellence to include competencies that traditional metrics miss." She gestured to her team. Ahmed Hassan identified a $200 million market opportunity in Middle Eastern healthcare that our traditional analysts completely overlooked. Maria Santos prevented a costly mistake in our Latin American expansion by recognizing regulatory complexities our legal team missed. Chen Wei's infrastructure proposals have revolutionized our approach to Asian markets. Richard's expression remained skeptical. "Anecdotal successes don't justify systematic organizational changes." "You're right," Grace agreed, surprising everyone in the room. "Anecdotal successes don't justify systematic changes, but comprehensive transformation does." Grace opened her laptop and displayed a presentation that nobody, including Robert, had seen before. "What I'm about to show you represents the culmination of everything we've learned over the past 90 days. It's not just proof that the Cultural Integration Initiative works. It's a blueprint for Morrison Industries to become the first major American corporation to successfully compete in global markets by leveraging cultural competency as a core business strategy." The first slide took everyone's breath away. Project Global Bridge, a $2.3 billion international expansion strategy. Grace clicked through detailed market analyses, partnership proposals, and financial projections that demonstrated how Morrison Industries could capture market share in 17 countries by applying the cultural expertise they'd been developing. Project Global Bridge isn't just about doing business internationally, Grace explained. It's about doing business internationally in ways that American companies have never successfully achieved before. Instead of imposing American business models on foreign markets, we adapt our approaches to leverage local expertise and cultural understanding. The room was silent as board members absorbed the scope of what Grace was proposing. Ahmed Hassan stood up. "If I may add context, what Grace is describing would position Morrison Industries ahead of every competitor in Middle Eastern markets. The cultural competency we've developed gives us access to partnerships and opportunities that traditional approaches can't reach. Maria Santos joined him. The same advantage applies throughout Latin America. We're not just translating American business practices. We're creating hybrid approaches that honor local business cultures while delivering Morrison Industries' technical excellence. Richard Hayes looked increasingly uncomfortable as the presentation continued. This all sounds very ambitious, but you're asking us to restructure our entire international strategy around employees whose primary qualification is cultural background. Grace felt the moment crystallizing around a fundamental choice. Morrison Industries could continue operating as it always had, achieving steady but limited growth, or it could embrace a transformation that carried enormous risk and unprecedented potential. "Mr. Hayes," Grace said quietly, "you keep referring to cultural background as if it's separate from professional qualification. But what we've discovered is that in global markets, cultural competency isn't just helpful, it's essential. The choice isn't between cultural diversity and business excellence. The choice is between cultural competency and business failure in international markets." She clicked to her final slide. Morrison Industries' Global Bridge Division, projected 5-year revenue, $8.7 billion. The number hung in the air like a challenge to everything the company had believed about its own potential. Robert Morrison leaned forward. "Grace, this is remarkable work, but you're asking us to bet the company's future on an approach that's never been tried before." Grace felt Marcus's words echoing in her mind. Trust the work. Trust yourself. "Robert, 6 months ago, Morrison Industries was a successful regional company with limited international presence. Today, we're positioned to become a global leader in culturally integrated business development. The choice isn't whether to take risks. The choice is whether to take smart risks that leverage our newly discovered competitive advantages." She paused, looking around the table at faces that would determine not just her future, but the futures of everyone who had dared to believe that their hidden potential could transform an entire organization. "I'm not asking you to bet on an untested approach. I'm asking you to bet on results we've already achieved and people who've already proven their value. The only question is whether Morrison Industries is ready to become the company it could be." The board's decision was unanimous, but not in the way Grace had expected. "Grace," Robert Morrison said after 2 hours of heated deliberation, "the board approves the Cultural Integration Initiative expansion and agrees to move forward with a modified version of Project Global Bridge." Grace felt relief flooding through her, but Robert's expression suggested there was more. "However," he continued, "we're implementing this in phases, with strict oversight and performance benchmarks at each stage. Richard Hayes will serve as executive oversight for the project, with authority to halt implementation if benchmarks aren't met." The condition hit Grace like a physical blow. Richard Hayes, the man who had questioned her integrity and opposed her vision from the beginning, would now have veto power over everything she'd built. Richard's smile was coldly professional. "I look forward to working closely with Ms. Washington to ensure this initiative meets the highest standards of corporate accountability." After the meeting, Grace sat in her office staring at the Chicago skyline, trying to process what felt like victory and defeat simultaneously. Her team had been approved for expansion. Project Global Bridge was moving forward. But every decision would now be subject to scrutiny from someone who viewed their success as a threat to traditional corporate structures. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Ahmed Hassan entered, followed by Maria Santos, Chen Wei, and the other core team members. "Grace," Ahmed said gently, "we know what you're thinking. But we wanted you to know something important." Maria stepped forward. 6 months ago, I was invisible in this company. Now I'm leading economic analysis for Latin American expansion. That happened because you saw potential where others saw only a cleaning lady. Chenwei nodded. Richard Hayes can oversee our work, but he can't oversee our determination. We're not going to let his skepticism diminish what we've accomplished. Grace felt tears forming in her eyes. You don't understand the position this puts us in. Every decision, every recommendation, every success will be questioned and second-guessed. Richard isn't just overseeing, he's looking for reasons to prove we don't belong here. Fatima Al-Zahra, who rarely spoke in group settings, stepped forward. Grace, I fled Lebanon during the war. I rebuilt my life 3 times in different countries. I learned that hostile oversight is just another obstacle, not an insurmountable barrier. But what if we fail? What if Richard finds legitimate concerns, or we make mistakes under pressure? Ahmed smiled with quiet confidence. Then we'll address those concerns and learn from those mistakes. Grace, you taught us that excellence isn't about being perfect. It's about being adaptable, culturally intelligent, and focused on results. David Kim, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Grace, there's something you need to understand. This team exists because you believed in potential that others couldn't see. But now we believe in that potential too. Richard Hayes can scrutinize our work, but he can't scrutinize our commitment to proving that cultural competency is a business advantage. That evening, Grace visited Marcus at the memory care facility, finding him in the garden, where he often sat watching birds at the feeder. His moments of clarity had become increasingly rare. But tonight, his eyes focused on her face with startling intensity. You look troubled, he said softly. Grace described the board meeting, the conditional approval, and the oversight arrangement that felt more like surveillance than support. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he was quiet for several minutes, his gaze drifting to the evening sky. Grace, do you remember when I was first diagnosed? The neurologist told us that Alzheimer's was a progressive disease with no cure, no effective treatments, and no hope for improvement. Grace nodded, remembering the devastating consultation that had changed their lives forever. But you didn't accept that prognosis as final. You researched experimental treatments, found specialists who were exploring new approaches, and insisted that we fight for every lucid moment, every preserved memory. Marcus reached for her hand. You turned a hopeless diagnosis into 12 years of meaningful life together. This is different, Marcus. This isn't about fighting disease. It's about fighting people who don't want to change. Marcus smiled with the wisdom that had made him such an effective counselor. Grace, the principle is the same. When experts tell you something is impossible, you find ways to make it possible. When systems resist change, you create new systems. When people question your qualifications, you prove them with results. He squeezed her hand gently. Richard Hayes isn't your enemy, Grace. He's your motivation. Every success you achieve under his oversight becomes undeniable proof that your approach works. Grace felt something shifting inside her. The same determination that had carried her through years of caring for Marcus, through nights of cleaning offices after days of international negotiations, through moments when giving up would have been easier than continuing. You know what I realized today, she said slowly. This conditional approval isn't a limitation, it's an opportunity. If we can succeed under hostile oversight, we prove definitively that cultural competency isn't just feel-good diversity. It's competitive advantage that delivers results regardless of skepticism. Marcus's eyes lit up with pride. There's the woman I married, the one who turns obstacles into stepping stones. As Grace drove home that night, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Project Global Bridge wasn't just about expanding Morrison Industries internationally. It was about proving that recognizing hidden potential and leveraging cultural competency could transform how American businesses compete globally. Richard Hayes thought he was protecting traditional corporate values. But Grace realized he was actually providing the perfect laboratory conditions to demonstrate that those traditional values needed to evolve. The real test wasn't behind them, it was just beginning. 18 months after Grace Washington first translated between Robert Morrison and Khalil al-Rashid, she stood in Morrison Industries' new International Cultural Competency Center, watching her team conduct a video conference with partners in 7 countries simultaneously. The scene would have been impossible to imagine during her years pushing a cleaning cart through these same hallways. Project Global Bridge had exceeded every projected benchmark. Morrison Industries' international revenue had grown by 520% in 12 months, with contracts in 23 countries and cultural competency training programs that were being studied by Harvard Business School as a revolutionary approach to global expansion. But the transformation went deeper than financial metrics. Richard Hayes approached Grace's desk, carrying a folder that she recognized as his quarterly oversight report. Over the past year, his antagonism had gradually shifted to grudging respect, then to genuine appreciation for results he couldn't dispute. "Grace, I need to discuss something with you," he said, his tone formal but not hostile. Grace looked up from the partnership proposal she was reviewing. "Is there a problem with the quarterly numbers?" Richard set down the folder and did something that surprised her. He smiled. "The problem, Grace, is that your success has made me realize how wrong I was about everything." He opened the folder, revealing pages of glowing assessments and unprecedented performance metrics. "For 18 months, I've been looking for flaws in your approach, mistakes in your judgment, evidence that cultural integration was compromising business excellence." Grace felt her breath catch. "And what did you find?" "I found that cultural competency isn't just a nice addition to business strategy. It's fundamental to competing in global markets. Your team doesn't just translate languages. You translate entire ways of thinking about business relationships." Richard paused, his expression thoughtful. "Grace, I owe you an apology. I was protecting systems that were holding Morrison Industries back from its potential." The apology was unexpected and deeply meaningful, but Grace sensed there was more. "Richard, what are you really trying to tell me?" "The board met yesterday. We want to offer you the position of Executive Vice President of Global Operations. You'd oversee all international business development with authority to implement cultural competency standards across every department." Grace stared at him in amazement. "You're offering me one of the highest positions in the company." "We're offering you the position your results have earned. Grace, Morrison Industries has become something unprecedented, an American company that succeeds internationally by embracing rather than imposing our cultural perspectives. That transformation happened because of your vision and your team's execution." That afternoon, Grace sat in the memory care facility's garden with Marcus, who was having one of his increasingly rare clear days. She'd brought photos of the Cultural Competency Center, newspaper articles about Morrison Industries' international success, and a letter from Khalil al-Rashid expressing his admiration for their partnership approach. "I'm proud of you," Marcus said simply, his voice carrying the warmth she remembered from their early years together. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," Grace replied. "Every decision I made, every risk I took, was possible because you taught me that love means supporting someone's potential even when it requires sacrifice." Marcus studied the photographs with careful attention. "Grace, do you remember what I said about regrets when you were deciding whether to take Robert's first job offer?" Grace nodded. "You said you regretted that your illness had made me smaller than I was meant to be." "I was wrong about something," Marcus said quietly. Your illness, our illness, didn't make you smaller. It prepared you to recognize potential that others miss because you understood what it feels like to have your abilities overlooked. He touched one of the newspaper articles gently. Every person whose career you've transformed, every international partnership you've facilitated, every barrier you've broken, all of that became possible because you learned to see value where others see only obstacles. Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized the profound truth in Marcus's words. Her years of struggle hadn't been preparation for success. They had been the foundation of it. 6 months later, Grace stood before the Chicago Economic Development Council, delivering a keynote address about cultural competency in global business. Morrison Industries had become a case study taught in business schools worldwide, and Grace had been invited to share their approach with other companies seeking international expansion. But as she looked out at the audience of executives and entrepreneurs, Grace found herself thinking not about corporate strategy or market penetration, but about a cleaning lady who had spent 8 years invisible in corporate hallways, listening to conversations in languages that revealed opportunities others couldn't see. The most valuable resources in your organizations aren't always listed in your directories or reflected in your org charts, she told the audience. Sometimes they're pushing cleaning carts, answering phones, or working night shifts while caring for family members who need them. Grace paused, thinking about Marcus, about Ahmed and Maria and Chen and all the others whose potential had been waiting for recognition. Your competitive advantage isn't just about finding the best talent. It's about recognizing the extraordinary capabilities that already exist in unexpected places. The question isn't whether that talent is there. The question is whether you're prepared to see it. As applause filled the auditorium, Grace Washington, former State Department liaison, former cleaning lady, current executive vice president of global operations, smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that the most transformative discoveries often begin with simply paying attention to the people around you. The cleaning lady's gift hadn't been translation services or cultural competency. It had been the revelation that remarkable potential exists everywhere, waiting for someone with the wisdom to recognize it and the courage to nurture it into something extraordinary. In the end, that gift had transformed not just Morrison Industries, but everyone it touched, including Grace herself.